Hello and welcome to the Political Orphanage, a home for plucky misfits and problem solvers. I'm your host, Andrew Heaton, back in Scotland this week. So if you could water my plants while I'm out of town, that'd be swell. Also, water my mail while you're at it. Thanks. I sure do meet a lot of Europeans, and a question I ask pretty much all of them, for coming up on a decade now, is, do you like your country's health care? Everyone emphatically says yes, and then convey their pity, mystification, and a touch of anger at the United States' utter failure to provide universal health care. They are amazed that a modern, developed nation like America, what with our superior mall and truck technology, does not have nationalized health care like Britain, or single-payer health care a la Canada, or some kind of super Romney care hybrid model like Germany. They are astonished. And for the record, I think our health care is horrible. More on that later. Then I ask our new European friend, do you think your healthcare system would be improved if instead of being run by your country, there was one big European Union healthcare system run out of Brussels? If you could scrap your Dutch healthcare and instead have a big EU healthcare service agency for everyone, would you want to do that? And to date, out of all the Europeans I've questioned, over 10 years, literally every single one over a decade, no one has told me yes. Rather, they say something to this effect. I, a technocratic European sophisticant, who likes the idea of socialism and speaks 3 languages and owns multiple scarves, I would prefer we keep our own health care. Our system works very well for Latvia or Denmark or whichever weirdly shaped country with funny hats that I live in. Other nations could take note of our gloriously competent healthcare system, but I don't think it would work better. Might not work at all if we tried to cram everybody in Europe from wildly different cultures and economies and polities into a single one-size-fits-all governmental system. That would be too big. No, thank you. And that always fascinates me. It fascinates me in particular because I think about healthcare a lot and how we could fix our healthcare system, which I agree is perverse and inefficient and failing according to many, many metrics. I've lived over in the United Kingdom. I'm there right now. And as a consumer, I prefer the NHS system over the American health insurance company that I deal with its premiums and in-group networks and mystery bills that I receive a year and a half later. If I could snap my fingers and have a national healthcare service as cheap and effective as, Finland's, I would. Even Latvia. Latvia is the poor man's Finland. But then I wonder, would Finland's model scale up from 5.5 million people in an ethnically homogeneous area the size of Montana to a vastly larger and more complex polyglot continent with widely differing economic situations spanning a population of 330 million people? More people live in the city of Los Angeles than in the entire nation of Slovenia. More people live in San Antonio than all of Estonia combined. Of the 27 EU member states, only 5 countries have over 20 million people. The majority of those countries, of those European countries, are 10 million folks or less. European countries are the size of our states. What we consider a national government, the debates that we have in America, if implemented over there, would be considered a supranational government. Now, noting all of that, would what works well in Finland effectively scale up and apply equally well to the whole of the United States? I kind of doubt it. And so far, so do all of the Europeans I've ever spoken to, at least when I frame the question as subsuming their national system into a big EU agency equivalent. So on today's program, we're going to ask a big question. It's abstract, but it's deep, and I'm going to argue it's very relevant to governance. One which I'm frankly surprised has never been hammered out by political scientists. In fact, to my knowledge, it's not even a question that they ask or a field of debate with competing sides. I am astonished by this. because it's a question which strikes me as kind of obvious and fundamental to effective governance, which I am in favor of. I want a government to be effective and efficient and competent at what it does. And that question is, what is the optimum size of a state, a nation state, a country, in terms of competency, efficiency, and minimal corruption in government? Is there a particular size of state that does best? Can countries be too small to function? Can they be too large and unwieldy for the government to function well? I ask this because we pretty well figure this out with doors. You don't see a lot of wildly differing door shapes, with the exception of big-ass cathedral flaps or little novelty hobbit holes like in Latvia. 99% of the doors on a house or a business are rectangular, 36 inches wide, and 80 inches tall. You'll never see a door in America anywhere that's 1 foot wide and 8 feet tall, or 8 feet wide and 2 feet tall. Nobody's debating optimum door size. We've worked that out. And yet, there's no consensus on how big a government gets before it becomes stupid, sclerotic, or wasteful, or how small it could shrink before it would become anemic and ineffective. Isn't that bizarre? Am I going crazy here? Doesn't that strike you as something we should have done quant analysis on by now, like in the last 200 years, last 50? We should have just got metrics together and gone, oh, okay, if your country gets above this certain level, it either has to split up or become a federation or become more private sector oriented. Or alternately, no, it turns out there's absolutely no correlation. I'm just surprised that this isn't something that's been hammered out. That esoteric, yet deeply pertinent question to the nature of effective governance itself is what we're going to explore today, right here on The Political Orphanage. The Political Orphanage is a podcast measuring exactly 36 inches wide and 80 inches tall, depending on humidity. And it's made possible by its listeners who support it on Patreon. Be like the cool kids and head to patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. Hey, let me ask you something. Think about all the political debates raging right now about apparently there's like a sexy M&M now and like a coward M&M, and they got fired or something. That's a thing. Have you heard about that? That's a whole thing last week in the news about the M&Ms, about what do you call them? Anamorphic M&Ms, and somehow they have to do with the culture war. That was a thing. Then there's all the stuff about classified documents, with Pence and Trump and Biden, and then Kevin McCarthy winning the congressional popularity contest. All that mudslinging involved in that. You ever hear anybody try to figure out the optimum size of a government, where they just sit down with a bunch of numbers and rulers and graphs and things and go, hey, maybe we should take a crack at this? Anybody ever doing that? How often do you encounter somebody who rolls up their sleeves and just works on basic governance? Well, that's the kind of thing we do on The Political Orphanage. Hardly ever hear me talk about goddamned M&Ms and their effect on culture. We don't spout off anecdotes of the party you don't like being bad so you can feel snug and self-righteous in your confirmation bias. It's not just a litany of grievances against Team Stupid, however you define Team Stupid, because of course our team's good. We're not doing that. That's not why this show is around. If you're thinking, the Political Orphanage is doing something interesting, it's doing something worthwhile, it's putting in time and smarts in a whole realm a lot of shows never even venture into, and I want to be a part of that, then I invite you to go to patreon.com/Andrew Heaton and help me make America a little smarter and a little funnier. And as a thank you, get a weekly bonus episode every week. Last week, I brought on my old friend and economics mentor, Gene Epstein, to argue with me for an entire hour about education. It was alternately heartwarming and infuriating, depending on who you're talking to, but it got a lot of engagement. Really got some people worked up, but it was interesting. This week, I am going to talk to Ethan Petty. He's a listener of the show who, somewhat pertinent to today's episode, is going to talk about how he opted out of the health insurance system in the U.S. and joined a mutual aid society and is very much in favor of it and has pretty much converted me to that. If you're interested in what mutual aid looks like, as opposed to having a health insurance private sector kind of thing we've got over here or a nationalized system over in England, this is a very interesting episode. And you can find it by going to patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. That's patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. Thanks. Scaling issues exist. Pretty much all other areas of life, scaling. Take a cute town with a lot of bicycle lanes and charming boat canals. Amsterdam, Brugge, Venice. All walkable, adorable European cities in which I have been hungover. If the population of those burgs expanded to the size of New York City, you couldn't just multiply the amount of canals and sidewalks to compensate. That wouldn't work. The urban density and the amount of people crammed into skyscrapers in a Brugge, however you want to say it, of 11 million people would make it impossible for a network of bike lanes and canals to handle that bulk of transit. You would have to add in a subway or a tram or a highway or a monorail or something. My preference, segways. I think they're going to make a comeback. As the size of the city changes, the nature of the transit would change as well. Not just the population, but its nature, its shape. If issues of scaling apply to governance, and I'm going to make the case that they do this episode, then the size of government alters the nature of its governance, which means that some things which work well for a small country will not work the same way or as well for a large country, and must be fundamentally altered in the process to achieve the same outcome. If scalability is a salient factor in governance, then folks who understandably salivate at the statecraft of Nordic countries, which, by the way, I think work very well, might do well to implement those sorts of programs at our state level, in Vermont or New Hampshire or wherever you want to try it, rather than trying to replicate it at what the Europeans would consider a supranational level. A couple of years ago, I interviewed an engineer about building a giant robot. This was not on the Political Orphanage. This was on my sci-fi podcast, Alienating the Audience, and I wanted to talk to this engineer. Theoretically, what do you have to do to build a giant robot? I had assumed if you want to build a big robot, you just find a good model of a robot. You go to robot.com and buy the blueprints or whatever. Then you triple it in size until you have a steel monstrosity you can trot out at parades and Burning Man. Apparently, it doesn't work that way because of scaling. Even though the proportions can be identical in a small, easily managed household robot and a building-sized robot, gravity operates at the same rate for both, which alters the equation. What that means is, in the case of a giant robot, the feet have to support all that weight, meaning that the base-to-weight ratio of a small robot is actually different than that of a large robot, even if the schematics are proportioned. A larger robot needs bigger feet. That's what all that means. If you're going to build a bigger robot, you have to have bigger feet compared to the smaller robot. I'm going to drop this one because this one's getting weird, the giant robot thing. I probably lost some people. Let me start over. We're talking about scaling. Let me try a different model here. Hummingbirds can't get any bigger. If a hummingbird were the size of a condor, not only would it be terrifying, its heart would explode. The system can't simply get bigger with the same proportion and work as well or at all. A hummingbird just can't scale up no matter how many steroids I gave it before the city told me to stop. Or let's say cooking. Some ingredients are more sensitive to scaling than others. If you want to make a cake that's twice as big as the recipe calls for, you can double some ingredients, like flour or parsley, but salt, spices, and alcohol punch harder. So in upsizing, you only multiply the punchy ones by 1.5. Everything else you multiply by 2. Otherwise, you get a horrible parsley cake in this example. I don't know why I mentioned parsley, but you get the point. Now, granted, there are some material differences between Washington, D.C. and a medium-sized robot or humming condor. But I think a lot of scaling issues would apply. We do know of at least one limit to scaling for us humans, and that's Dunbar's number. The British sociologist Robin Dunbar calculated the maximum troop size for various types of apes. How big can a gang of chimps get before it becomes unsustainably large? At some point, a really big gang of chimps, a troop I believe it's called, will split into two, or it'll run off a handful of the less popular chimps, or some of the curmudgeonly males will go off and form a Rotary Club, or they'll just kill each other till the numbers thin out, and it drops to a stable level. There is a maximum sustainable troop size for chimps. I don't remember the actual numbers for any of these, but let's say for illustrative purposes that baboons can have up to a dozen in a group, orangutans are up to 20, gorillas can have as high as 30, and chimps top out at 40. And horny bonobos can sustain a group of 60, let's say. Dunbar then compared those various group sizes to the size of their corresponding brain pans per species. And from there, he was able to come up with an algorithm. Based on the size of an ape's brain, you can infer how big their group can get before that group becomes unsustainable. And then he took that algorithm that worked with all those different apes and he applied it to us humans. And what he came up with was 150. 150 is the maximum sustainable size of a natural human group unit. Now, obviously, we can have groups larger than 150. We don't start murdering each other in Times Square and the like. But what's magical about that particular threshold is that 150 people is as big as a group can get before you start needing name tags. 150 people or less, every single member can individually know every other member. After 150, you don't personally know everybody, so the nature of the group changes. Personally, I think you could probably have whatever kind of government you want or no government at all, as long as your society never exceeds 150. If you want to form a commune or a kibbutz, you can kind of do whatever you want, as long as you keep the number at 150 or below, because everyone there can interact as individuals. You can work out all of your problems between yourselves, or the whole group can meet around a campfire every Friday to adjudicate disputes. And the entire community acts as one entity and everybody knows each other. You don't have to worry about freeloaders because we know who's actually working and who's loafing around. But once you get above 150, not everybody knows each other. There are too many people for every individual to keep track of who's loafing around or not. So you're going to have a manager in charge of gardening or cleaning or building giant robots. Instead of working everything out around the fire in a big group that's not sustainable anymore, it's not possible, you have to have judges come in to handle disputes. Get a few thousand people, and now you need a chieftain or a ruling council to pick the managers and the judges. All of that's fine, but there is a sort of scaling issue at there, right? You can't. We could have 150 people all vote on whatever we wanted to do every Friday, and granted, we'd always have pizza if we were to put it to a vote, but we could probably do it. But trying to get everyone in a 50,000 person society to vote on everything really wouldn't work very well. Like if you want somebody to just, we're all going to vote for Bob. Bob, you're in charge of where we put stop signs. That there's going to be some kind of alteration as we get bigger to affect the scope and scale of the state. But most of us political orphans, we don't live in a nomadic tribe or a commune or a kibbutz, although someday I'd kind of like to. We live in nation states. Which brings us back to today's central question. What is the optimum size of a state? How big must a nation be to enjoy a scale of economy, to build rockets and giant robots? How big can it grow before its bureaucracy becomes sclerotic and stupid and results in the movie Idiocracy or Emperor Palpatine? Maybe scaling works the other way around. Larger countries wind up more efficient than smaller countries because they have larger reserves of intellectual or capital resources. Walmart can produce more things cheaper than a mom-and-pop store can. A significant part of the reason why large corporations outcompete tiny local businesses is that economies of scale favor a large corporation, whose larger labor pool allows for greater specification and therefore larger output, as opposed to a small business where everybody has to be something of a generalist. I suspect, and we'll test out my hypothesis shortly, that a nation-state needs a minimum of 3 million people to function optimally. My theory is if you have less than 3 million people, you run the risk of insufficient net taxpayers. 1 million people might not be enough to support a military that could effectively defend your state against other states. Or more benignly, it may not be big enough to have a risk pool for managing an effective healthcare system, or simply to pay for the various public services that the majority of the people, including conservatives and libertarians, think are justifiably the remit of government. America and Russia could produce NASA and Commie NASA, whatever they called it. But it's not like Liechtenstein is ever going to produce an equal amount of tiny, gilded rockets, little Swiss-type rockets. El Salvador is not going to run a moon landing. So I theorize you need some base level of taxpayers to be able to do big things. But the majority of political debates in our country are not about scaling down, however. We are not a nation of tiny Liechtensteins debating whether or not we want to team up into a Switzerland. We passed that long ago. Most of the debates we're having are about expanding government activity at the national level, what the Europeans, again, would think of as a supranational level. So in terms of scaling up, which we'll primarily focus on the rest of this episode, I hypothesize there's an effective barrier or a effectiveness threshold of 10 million people. You can have a nation state which exceeds 10 million. I've seen it. But the further past that population you get, the more the population expands, the more fat and sluggish the government gets, just fatter and fatter. Obviously, you can have a fat country with more than 10 million people. I just suspect the government won't work as well. Or it would need to radically alter how the governance is done than it would have at 5 million people. It'll become increasingly inefficient, sclerotic, and so forth as it struggles to scale up to accompany that engorged population. So that's my hypothesis. The optimal size of a state is 3 to 10 million people. Here shortly, we'll stack up my hypothesis against the numbers, insofar as we can find relevant numbers, and test to see if I'm an idiot or not. I might be. Incidentally, I did not know the answer to any of this before I started working on the episode. I actually wrote what you're hearing right now before I started doing the research, and I'm trying to approach this as an engineer rather than as an ideologue. That is to say, I am open to altering or changing this hypothesis depending on what we reasonably infer from the data. Before we dive into those numbers, however, I do want to walk you through my logic on why I think a state becomes suboptimal after it exceeds 10 million people. I do have a rationale for this that I want to test. Now listen, it's traditional for anybody bemoaning big government to wail on bureaucracy like a cheap piñata. We're going to touch on that because we have to, but I'm assuming you've heard plenty of rants about red tape and dysfunctional government at this point in your life. I'm going to assume you, the listener, already have an understanding of that kind of thing, and so we're going to concentrate very little on that. So let's start out with a different angle. Rather than concentrating on how a larger population affects its government, I want to consider how a larger population affects the governed, the citizenry. Because in a democracy, the citizenry ideally selects competent statesmen to run the levers of power and tosses the bums out when they prove incompetent or corrupt. The citizenry is not just the endpoint consumer, it is a element of quality control in governing. It's part of the checks and balances. We are part of the checks and balances. In a small city or small state, like Vermont or Malta, Liechtenstein, I guess, you might actually know the people who are running the government. I've never been to Vermont, but my guess is folks in Vermont, more often than not, know whoever's running Vermont personally. If the mayor puts his cousin's idiot nephew in charge of trash collection, or the governor of New Hampshire hires 3 superfluous but very attractive secretaries, people might notice and grumble about that over at the diner. The smaller and more personally interconnected the government is to the citizens it represents, the more first-hand knowledge citizens have of the people running it. Did you know, this is true, did you know the Prime Minister of Iceland's home phone number is in the phone book? You can just call the Prime Minister of Iceland's house if you live in Iceland, the same way that you could call your mayor in America. You could just look up Bob Gelderson in the phone book and give him a call. You can't do that with, say, the President of France. I suspect that Iceland, whose entire population could comfortably fit inside of Austin, Texas, it's harder there for an idiot to hold higher office. Not impossible, but harder. I don't live in a place like that. In where I live, it's a constituency of thousands of people, and thousands of people from multiple government jobs. Less than 1% of us personally know whoever's running for office, which means we have to rely on rhetoric, bullet points, things on their website. Maybe we get a debate. We're relying on the best we can, not including personal know-how. Whereas in a small locale, citizens can make decisions based on personal interactions. I know Sven is a moron. Marta, she's a go-getter. I'm going to vote for Marta. Now watch this. I'm going to flip it. Conversely, we see relative levels of sociopathy increase the further up people go in any organization. This goes for public and private sectors alike. It applies to government. It applies to the CEOs of big corporations. CEOs of big corporations are much more likely to be self-promoting cutthroats than low-level managers. For good or for ill, such a person, top level of a CEO, a top CEO in a company, can probably fire people that are underperforming in a department without getting particularly weepy about it. They're not going to lose sleep over it. That might be for good or for ill, but it does mean they have a capacity to not worry about what other people think of them, including the people they're firing. In politics, citizens tend to elect mayors, local interconnected officials that are higher in sociability and are motivated to a great extent by shame. They don't want to shame themselves. They don't want to lose their prestige in the community. They don't want to shame their family. They want to be able to go to the diner and have everybody at the diner love them, regardless of political party. Now, you go up higher in that governmental food chain, and I think it's all but impossible to argue that somebody who has no sense of shame, no shame at all, is going to have a much easier time getting elected to Congress than somebody who does. All things being equal, guy running for Congress that does not have a sense of shame, who is not bothered by people hating him or losing prestige in the community or hurting people's feelings, he's going to win the election, isn't he? He's going to be able to fight dirty and all that. I'm not saying that CEOs or senators or governors are sociopaths, but I am saying sociopathic and egotistical tendencies are more problematic in small interpersonal relationships like local politics, but they become a tactical advantage in large impersonal elections. And if we're talking about scaling, impersonal elections are going to increase in phenomenon the bigger the state. They're going to shrink as a phenomenon the lesser the state. A little less than 2 million people live in the nation of Latvia. If you're really worked up about something in Latvia, chances are, with a little bit of effort, you can meet whoever the relevant government official in charge of that thing is. In a country of 1.8 million people, your chances of personally knowing your member of parliament or getting somebody elected who sympathizes with your pet issue are decent. Members of parliament there have constituencies of about 18,000 people. That is a very small constituency. You can definitely meet your representative and chat his ear off in a constituency of 18,000 people. So 1.8 million people in Latvia, whereas in Germany, there are 83 million people. Your odds of personally knowing multiple Reichstag or Bundestag members are pretty low. Each Bundestag member has a constituency of 116,000 Germans, more than about 10 times what a Latvian delegate has. You may never meet with or speak to your representative. You may not know who they are. Probably don't get to talk to them every year for an hour. Latvia has a ratio of about 18,000 voters per representative. An American congressional district is set at 762,000 people. So each member of Congress has a district of about 762,000 people. Granted, that's not a fixed ratio. That's arbitrary. We've decided to do that. We could theoretically create more congressional districts to make constituencies smaller. James Madison wanted to do that. He wanted the Constitution to have an amendment setting the size of a congressional district permanently at 30,000 people. And whenever the population of the country got bigger, we would just add congressional seats as needed. But everybody would always have a 30,000 person congressional district, which I'm in favor of, incidentally. I think it's a good idea. So let's try that out. We drastically reduce the size of a congressional district in America. We reap the benefits of constituencies which better screen for incompetency or graft because representatives are elected more through personal firsthand familiarity with them. More likely, you know the guy was the idiot at your high school. You're not going to vote for him. Terrific. All good. If we did this, if we create new congressional districts that match the Latvian ratio of one representative for every 18,000 people, then the newly expanded United States Congress will have 18,438 members in it. Even assuming these small constituencies result in higher quality leaders, I think it would, but it's debatable, more competency, less sociopaths, those high quality leaders that we're now getting because of the smaller constituencies are going to have a devil of a time getting anything done in a House of Representatives with over 18,000 people in it. Jesus. The Latvian parliament has 100 seats. So all things being equal, in terms of gerrymandering or constituent ratios, if it's all working well, which is already a big if, but if it's all working well, a Latvian member of parliament only has to convince 50 peers to come around to her position to effect national change. Get 50 of your peers to come onto your bill and you can nationalize the adult toy industry or privatize the Ministry of Dog Toy Acquisitions, whatever it is. Get subsidies to build giant robots, invade Burning Man, as we all want to do. Convince 50 people of your plan, maybe a few more if they have some kind of presidential veto, but it seems doable. Under our newly expanded Congress, with over 18,000 members in it, a U.S. representative would have to convince more than 900 people to sign on to her bill before we could implement national changes. Think about how well Congress works right now. Just hold that on your mind for a moment. Does it work super well? Whatever you feel it is right now, picture that on your head. Now consider how effective that would be if Congress was passing budgets and legislation with 18,000 members involved. As we'll see later in the episode, there are some unfortunate deficits I run into in qualifying effectiveness and competency across national governments. There are going to be some blind spots that we just don't have data at the moment to solve some of these things. But we can say with absolute mathematical certainty that as a democracy gets bigger, either the value of an individual citizen's vote declines because there are so many voters diluting that process, or alternately, you have more elected representatives that have less impact in the legislative process. No way around that. Back to the citizenry. I've just spoken about how much mathematical dilution of vote gets the bigger a country becomes for each citizen, and the lack of personal knowledge citizens have of the people they're electing. But I've come up with a theory. I think this is mine. I don't know of anybody else that's postulated it. I'm going to run it by you. And the theory is this. Just as this firsthand knowledge of your representatives is attenuating the bigger the country gets, so does attention. The average citizen does not pay equal attention to local, state, county, and national government. Attention doesn't scale up. The way people seem to work is we always pay disproportionate attention to whatever the top level of government is, which sucks attention from all the stratas beneath it. Everybody knows who the president is. My guess is that 99% of the population knows the name of the president. Most people have heard of their governor or senator. Very few people recall the names of their city councilman or city councilwoman or state legislator. I do this for a living. I'm getting paid to do this right now. I can't remember my guy's name in the state legislature. I think it's Skippy Svenmarta or something. This obvious issue that people scrutinize national politics but ignore local politics is often used as an argument against local control. If the citizenry is indeed a vital part of quality control in government, it's part of the checks and balances, it's much less active at the local level than the national level. Therefore, local government tends to be less scrutinized, and there's not active democratic participation in it, and all of the problems we talked about are amplified at the local level, and they're not as big of a deal at the national level because people are paying attention to the national level. But that argument presupposes that people never care about local government, therefore local government is less positively influenced by the democratic process. But I don't think that's true. I think that people are misunderstanding the relevant phenomenon. It's not that people are unconcerned with local governance or state governance, let's call it regional governments for our purposes. It's not that people are unconcerned about local governance or regional governance. It's that our attention naturally gravitates towards whatever the top level of government is. Meaning that the more layers of government you have, which you're going to accrue as a state expands, the less and less attention the average citizen applies to the ground floor. I'm going to run a scenario by you. New Zealand and Alabama both have populations of about 5 million people. My guess is, I haven't had time to look this up, my guess is a much higher percentage of Kiwis know who their member of parliament is than Alabamans who know their state legislator. The size of both populations and their relevant legislatures are about the same. Yet, almost certainly, New Zealanders are more keenly aware of their legislature and what it does than Alabamans are of theirs. Did you know the Australian Constitution has a provision which allows for New Zealand to join as a state? That's true. When Australia and New Zealand became their own countries outside of the British Empire, Australia just assumed that New Zealand would naturally join it eventually, that they would be the same country. Still a backdoor provision in the Constitution should that ever happen. Let's suppose it did. Hypothetically, New Zealand joins Australia. It is now a state within the Australian Federation. In that scenario, I think you would find the average Kiwi would become much less aware of their member of state parliament in Wellington, in New Zealand, and much more aware of the politics occurring at the national level in Canberra. Conversely, let's say Texas seceded from the United States. Did you know Texas used to be its own country? They mention that quite a lot. I don't know if you've ever heard them get anybody from West Texas drunk. They'll tell you. Anyway, they used to be their own country. Let's say theoretically Texas became its own country again in the future. No more governmental ties to Washington. It's the Republic of Texas. There's no more legal relevance to Washington, D.C. than there is to Ottawa or Mexico City. Over time, citizens in Texas would probably pay more attention to what goes on in Austin and be more apt to name their state senator, their senator in the Republic, than they currently do now. Because, as I said, my theory is attention naturally drifts to the top layer at the expense of everything below. If that's true, the bigger your country gets, the more levels of government it gets, the less effective the lower ones are going to become. So far, we've been discussing population size, but I suspect geography is a factor too. In Scandinavia, with their cornucopia of wonderful social programs and high taxes and cradle-to-grave public safety nets, and incidentally, a much lower regulatory burden than we've got in the States, I would take that deal. How far is anyone from being able to voice concerns to a meaningful official? In many of those Scandinavian countries, taxes and spending occur at the local level. It's kind of like the county-based governance, meaning that if your government's being stupid, you can just wander down to the pub and yell at Hans or Hoyt or whoever about blowing the budget on reindeer pheromones or whatever Swedes get worked up about. If it's some hiccup at the national level, you're living in a country smaller than Texas. You're never too far away from the center of power. Now, admittedly, that geographic factor is much less of an issue now than it was 2 centuries ago because of airplanes and Skype and sexting. But technology won't ever entirely eliminate the relationship between geographic proximity and responsiveness. South Carolina and Singapore have comparable populations. But Singapore is only 281 square miles, whereas South Carolina is 32,000 square miles. It makes sense to me that a central authority overseeing what is effectively a tight, dense population immediately surrounding it is going to be more efficient than a central authority governing a disparate population scattered hours away in all directions. At the very least, the scale of economy would work better in Singapore because you'd be able to focus resources on highly trafficked, dense urban roads, and you wouldn't be spending very much money on long, underutilized but necessary rural roads. Consider the following scenario. We're back in America now. Texas is still a part of the Union, but New Zealand's still a part of Australia. Yay, everybody's getting along. Anyway, we're in America. You've got to choose between 2 Senate candidates. They have the same political views, same level of intelligence. Everything's pretty much the same. There's one key difference. One of these candidates promises to stay in the Capitol full-time. They'll be active on social media, they'll be responsive on email, they'll do Zoom calls, but they're not going to go home. You can fly to them if you want, schedule a meeting, but they're not going home to the district. They're not going to be active in the home state. The other lives in the district part-time and works in Washington part-time. They're going to commute. That guy's going to fly back and forth. His spouse works in the state. His kids go to school there. Of these 2 candidates, who's going to be more responsive and aware of what their constituents want? I'm going to say the latter, pretty obviously. Extending that logic outward, countries whose capital is within reasonable driving distance of most places are going to have representatives who live in their district full-time and commute into work. Whereas in America, which is the size of a continent, plus some stuff we conquered, only 40 people in Congress can actually do that. The rest have to split their time between work and the home district or simply ignore it and become a creature of Washington. Whereas presumably members of the Latvian parliament are more firmly entrenched in their local community than members of the EU parliament that have to commute. Fun fact, the EU parliament is based in 2 cities. Congress meets in Washington. The EU parliament meets in 2 cities, in 2 countries, no less. Their committee meetings are in Brussels, but plenary sessions are held in Strasbourg, and a major part of Parliament staff is based in a whole other city in Luxembourg. Every month, the EU Parliament has to pack up all its stuff and move from one city to the other, Strasbourg to Brussels, back and forth. Needlessly costs taxpayers an estimated $100 million a year, which is exactly the kind of stupid shit a giant super government representing 447 million people is apt to do. You don't see the German Bundestag bouncing from Hamburg to Berlin every 4 weeks because that would be moronic. But you scale up to 500 million people and you get that kind of logistical and budgetary frivolity. As with everything we've discussed so far, geographic proximity affects the responsiveness of politicians and affects the citizenry. So I further theorize that geographic proximity fosters social trust in the governed. A few years ago, I went up to New Hampshire to cover the primaries. The majority of governance there is handled locally. I think their state representatives get like $100 a year in gas money or something. Most of their government's done at the town level. They have town halls, one meeting to discuss what should the town potentially spend money on, and then once they make that determination, another meeting to vote on whether or not to actually spend that money on the thing we debated earlier. In a situation like that, where I can stand up and call out the idiots and thieves and root out my preferred bills and rant about reindeer pheromones or whatever they argue about in New Hampshire, I personally am going to be way more okay with paying taxes, and in fact, higher taxes than I currently do, than a system in which I know I have a minuscule vote going towards 2 senators and a congressman I have never met and never will meet, who fight with 532 other duds in a marble labyrinth 1,300 miles away. I don't even think you'd have to be active about it. I don't even think you have to attend the town hall meeting for there to be a kind of geographic trust relationship. I don't have the stats to back this up. This is pure conjecture on my part, but I suspect that the citizens who live in a state capital trust the legislature more than citizens who live in distant counties. If you live in the state capital and you drive past the building, the Capitol building on your way to work, and you run into the odd legislature at church or Hooters, you know that your town is the seat of power, and that's going to make you feel somewhat enfranchised to it. At some level, your identity and civic pride are caught up with the state government. Whereas if you're 5 hours away, you're going to be a little bit more skeptical that the legislature is working hard on your behalf. Which brings us to the issue of trust. So far, we've talked about personal familiarity lending itself to competency, delusion of votes, and so on and so forth. But I think that social trust is a factor in all of this, which is important for issues of scaling because social trust is important in democracy. The more active and robust a government is, like our friends in the Nordic countries, the more social trust is required of the population to permit that power. The further away I feel from the government, the less power I feel comfortable lending to it. When citizens don't trust their government, they don't feel close to it, they're not going to authorize it to do a lot. They're going to vote in favor of lower taxes and lower spending as opposed to a big, robust government. Practical ramification is that a modest population within small geographic areas is almost certainly going to have higher trust in government than a large population spread out across a geographically disparate area. And if we start to think of governing social capital as a resource, trust in government as a resource which can be depleted like money or electricity, the capacity of government alters based on its level of social trust. So Denmark, with factors that lead to very high social trust, a small, dense, homogeneous population, has enough social capital that the government can afford to create and maintain robust government programs. A larger population in a sprawling geographic area, like the United States, is going to have less social trust in government. The government has less governmental trust as a resource at its disposal, which means in terms of social capital, it can't afford programs nearly so large or robust. And I'm not even making a statement about the efficacy of such an initiative, only that there may be something akin to laws of physics in the relationship between size, trust in government, and size of government itself. When you have low trust in government, there's going to be some level of distrust from the citizenry. And so elective politics will more likely devolve into debates about whether or not to tear down or oppose a government program as opposed to fix it. I theorize countries which have higher trust in government are more apt to have a government focused on fixing problems, whereas countries with lower social trust in government are going to have governments more focused on tearing stuff down. And it's not just ideological, it's almost like a physical constraint based on geography and population. Okay, so far we've spoken about the effect of population on citizens and politicians, and I have been describing both more or less as good faith actors. Citizens who care about the place they live in, and statesmen who likewise care about their citizens and good government. But what about bad faith actors? People that are looking to be freeloaders and miscreants within the system. Any system, private, public, whatever, is going to have people who break the rules. And even more insidiously, at least to governance, it's going to have people that abuse the rules. People who are legally within the perimeters of the rules but are evading the spirit of the law or taking advantage of something that benefits them to the detriment of other people. Parasites. In an open democratic system, citizens get to lobby their government for changes in law. And that means lobbyists. If you want to have a free democratic society where citizens get to meet with their elected representatives to tell them issues that concern them, you're going to have lobbyists. There's no way around that. And remember, before I get into emails here, the Save the Spotted Owl Foundation, or Heaton for Electoral Reform, or the Give Buckets of Money to Sugar Growers of Florida, they're all special interests. Any interest that a bunch of people have, that is a special interest. You can't say, well, we're going to make a law that only good lobbyists get to go to Congress, only people with pure hearts, but we're going to outlaw bad lobbyists because obviously there's no way to neutrally make that determination. So the idea is just childish babble. Let's throw that out. If you want to have an open democracy where citizens, activists, and business and union leaders can meet with elected representatives to share their concerns, those people doing that are lobbyists. Sometimes lobbyists are helpful. They point out things to a politician that the politician might otherwise not know about a particular group or industry that's relevant. I can tell you from working on the Hill that while politicians dislike and hate and fear some lobbies, there are other lobbies that they view as sort of tiny consultant groups or think tanks that they don't have to pay, and they rely on them. Because unlike the congressman's office, a lobbying group employs full-time experts in very niche fields who might have good insight into some particular legislation. If I were a member of Congress, I would look at lobbyists like think tanks that have an agenda. They might be lying to me, but they also might have some good data and stuff. I would want to consult them, particularly if I didn't know very much about the thing that I was voting on. If a bill comes up on soybean curdling regulation, I might call up the American Soybean Curdling Council to see if I'm missing some obvious element of the soybean curdling process that they could correct me on before I get a vote on it. But then there are also the lobbyists agitating for handouts. Sugar subsidies, for example, which do absolutely no public good whatsoever. America is fat. And even if we weren't fat, we could get sugar cheaper from countries where Almighty God actually intended sugar to grow. Yet, Congress doles out $4 billion a year in handouts to useless, parasitical, cronyist sugar growers, mostly to one very wealthy family in Florida that I think of as about morally equivalent to the mafia, only with worse suits. Pisses me off, but it's never going to go away, because of an economic concept called dispersed costs and concentrated benefits. The Fanjul brothers of Florida, who convinced the government to get billions in sugar subsidies and are very, very wealthy, making Americans fat by stealing your money, they get billions of dollars annually from the United States government. Conversely, how much does their graft cost you? There are about 150 million taxpayers in the United States. That means, on average, taxpayers are shelling out about $26 a year in sugar subsidies. The Fanjul brothers down in Florida stand to net over $1 billion in handouts every year from Uncle Sam. It's definitely worth it to them to hire lobbyists to go up to Washington and hand out campaign donations to every single Florida politician and maybe just any fat guys from other states who look like they enjoy donuts. Easily worth $100 million a year in lobbying and campaign donations to them in order to secure that $1 billion in ill-gotten subsidies. But for you and me, for our individual contribution of $26, pissed off as I am, the math doesn't add up. I'm not going to take a week off work to fly to Washington, pay for the flight, book a hotel, meet my congressman, spend $900 to protect my $26. I might personally do that, but the vast majority of people, understandably, are not going to do that. And unfortunately, Congress does not divide its spending into stuff we all agree the government should do and frivolous bullshit. Would be great, but for some reason, they've never seemed to demarcate those into two separate piles. In a country of 330 million people, with a massive economy, and a government capable of gratuitous taxpayer handouts, there are a lot more vested interests than just lobbyists for sugar subsidies. And comparatively, they can be kind of tiny. $26 isn't a lot of money to you, and a lot of money to me. $4 billion isn't a lot of money to the United States. It's kind of pocket change. It's a rounding error over at the Pentagon. Those useless little barnacles stack up. They're not barnacles. I don't have a problem with barnacles. Barnacles don't hurt nothing. Leeches. That's what these people are. Literally thousands of industries and businesses and questionable nonprofits who just want to skim a little bit off the overall budget, just pennies to the average citizen, a nickel to everybody in the country. That nickel between 150 million people, that'll add up, won't it? Dispersed costs and concentrated benefits, which is a wonderful economic term, explains a lot, means that organizations will fight very hard to protect their handouts, but citizens will rarely have the impetus to really go after them because we're all aggregated. We're all individuals. It doesn't add up for us, but it makes up for them. We're paying the dispersed costs. They're getting the concentrated benefits. But when you add it up, it's death by 1,000 cuts. The bigger the state, the bigger the tax base, which means greater potential handouts. Yet at the same time, you also have more taxpayers from whom to distribute that largesse. The larger the state, the more exacerbated the issue of dispersed costs and concentrated benefits becomes. Let's say, for some insane reason, the Slovenian Sugarcane Association lobbied their National Assembly for a $4 billion handout. Same amount that the sugar subsidies are over here in the United States. That would cost the average Slovenian taxpayer $2,000 a year, nearly 100 times what we're getting gouged. It's easier to get a taxpayer fired up over $2,000 a year than it is to get him fired up over $26 a year. For $2,000 a year, I might well drive the 1.5 hours from my home to the Capitol to yell at somebody. $26 in 6 hours, probably not going to do it. But what if for some wacky reason, the Slovenian Sugarcane Association only wanted the same percentage of graft that the lowly Fanjul brothers do? Just $26 per Slovenian. That's all they want. Just $26, same as us. Fair enough. But instead of netting $4 billion a year, now the sugarcane cronies over in Slovenia are getting $54 million a year. Nothing to sneeze at, but considerably less than what's happening over here, and therefore less necessary to dispatch armies of lobbyists to capture. Concentrated benefits and dispersed costs are another inescapable element of increasing population size. The bigger the population, the more dispersed the costs, which will almost certainly proliferate the number of potential benefactors. Okay, so far, I've done a wonderful job of not bringing up the tired old subject of bureaucracy. That dead horse has not been beaten by yours truly. You're welcome. But we do briefly need to whack it a couple of times before we can move on. So, any organization, be it big or small, government employee or corporate leadership, private sector, public sector, charity, it's going to have a certain amount of administrative byproduct. Paperwork, red tape, redundancies, and so forth. Bureaucracy. It's easier for deadweight bureaucracy to fall through the cracks in a big government than a small one. Or I say that. I should admit here, I'm trying to be scrupulously honest in this episode, and I'm catching myself because I've got this kind of underlying ideological agenda fomenting, and I'm trying to think like an engineer here. In American politics, we definitely have more scrutiny at the national level than we do at the state and local level. But I posit that it's easier for deadweight bureaucracy to fall through the cracks in a big government than a small one, all things being equal. Private sector's better about it by nature. It's better at gunk removal because really gunky corporations with dumb red tape and stupid jobs and useless positions tend to go out of business or have a semi-sociopathic CEO that just lets 20% of the workforce go. And the successful ones are constantly reorganizing their resources away from underperforming ventures to profitable ones. Incentives are aligned in the private sector for CEOs to maximize efficiency and downsize unprofitable workers. The private sector, for good and ill, is largely self-cleaning. Since government officials don't operate on the basis of maximizing profit, nor should they, that's not how government ought to work, they're less hawkish about cleaning out gunk. Corporations can get rid of employees sociopathically, get rid of redundant departments. Governments operate more like hoarders. They're more like hoarders than sociopaths. Cleaning out clutter is far more emotionally taxing and difficult for a bureaucrat than it is for a CEO. They're going to keep all those newspapers and weird tchotchke dolls. It's very difficult. That said, decluttering is more of a priority for a public official operating with minimal resources than a politician operating with a large budget and a lot of wiggle room in it, because they don't have to. A city government has more pressure to cut out the fat in its budget than Congress does. It has less scrutiny, mind you. More people are paying attention to Congress in terms of the budget than they are at the local level. But a city has less options available to it and less income available to it. A city can sell bonds or it can increase taxes if their expenditure exceeds their revenue. But they can't print money. Cities can't print money. And if the city just sucks, if the government is incompetent or corrupt, that does happen. Bell, California is a great example of a just awful little a kleptocratic regime that got ignored for 20 years. If you're living in a place that's corrupt and incompetent and raising high taxes, citizens can just move away. They can just walk out, go to another county or something. Just as most EU member states use the euro for their currency, which means they lack the ability to print money when they run out of it. They actually have to operate within confines closer to reality than the American Congress does. And just like cities and states in America, European citizens can pick up and move anywhere else in Europe. If you're in Slovenia and you're pissed off about the sugar subsidies and you want to move over to the Czech Republic, you can just drive in your car over there. But you can't do that with a big national government like America. It's a lot more difficult. In both cases, constrained resources and freedom of movement creates competition and instills a certain level of administrative leanness just by necessity. Whereas a large government, like the United States, doesn't have those constraints. It has access to a giant tax base. If it runs out of money, it can print more. If taxes get too high or the services suck, and I'd argue definitely at least one of those things is a pretty recurring feature of American government, repatriating is a difficult process. I'm over in Scotland right now. I don't think I can just live here. I'd have to fill out a bunch of papers and pay bills. I don't think they'd take me anyway. I have to go back to America and pay my taxes. Austria can't print money. Belgium can't print money. And if either government becomes prohibitively incompetent, their citizens just relocate as easily as you would relocate to another county or move to Maine or somewhere. So as a result, the federal government in Washington, D.C. is demonstrably going to have less performance pressure and resource constraint than any single European government does. Any European government you're looking at is going to have more competitive pressure and more resource pressure than Washington, D.C. has, which is probably going to make them more competent. Then there's informational atrophy. Let's move on to another topic. As states become larger, they require intermediaries between the various levels of government, all of which require salaries and offices and program costs, and all of which add another potential decision maker in the process that could screw stuff up. Like in the childhood game telephone. The more intermediaries that exist between a normal citizen and a government official, the less accurate the transmission of data is up the food chain. The larger the state, the greater the amount of information which must be filtered and prioritized. If you're working on a project with one coworker, you can just look across the table and go, hey, Kevin, we need to build bigger feet on our giant robot. But you get a bunch of coworkers, and now you need a dedicated Slack channel. If you've ever worked at a big corporation, you know how full your inbox gets every day. Shuttling little bits of information and scheduling and yeses and nos and real quick I need an answer, all that. There are decent arguments that the expansion of email in society, while necessary, has actually made work much less efficient. That there's some new form of organization we're eventually going to invent, and that we're going to look back and go, email was a very understandable but inefficient way of communicating because we spend so much of our time dealing with tiny issues. But I think that's demonstrable, right? A team of 2 ladies is going to be easier to communicate and have less informational atrophy and inefficiency than a team of 50 people. The bigger the state, the bigger the Slack channel is going to need to be. The more misunderstandings or irrelevancies creep into discourse, and the more information in terms of diagnosing problems, desires of the population, or base metrics like prices are apt to get warped going up that food chain. And every time money passes through an intermediary, collected from taxpayers by an agency, which gives the money to Congress, which distributes the funds through other agencies back to taxpayers, there's going to be some amount of informational and monetary atrophy. Plus, the bigger the state, the more likely it is that there will be programs which duplicate those efforts at the national level or the local level, or overlap between existing departments that now have missions that get into each other's territory. So, I see a few reasons why you'd need to have a state that's at least a couple million people to operate at an optimal level. But I see myriad reasons that a large state is more apt to work less efficiently or nimbly or responsively compared to a smaller peer. If I'm right about scaling, a country of 5 million people might reasonably expect that for every dollar they spend in taxes, 80 cents goes to the thing it's actually supposed to solve. Homelessness, fire departments, whatever. 5% is going to be taken up by administration, and another 15% will be lost to some level of incompetency, corruption, fraud, and vested interests. But you're still getting a pretty good rate. 80% of the money you're spending is going to be on the thing. Like with charities, I think you want to keep admin at about 10%, 90% the actual thing. I'd be very happy for government to operate at 80% efficiency. In a country of 200 million, much larger than this other example, you might then reasonably infer that every tax dollar you spend, maybe 50 cents will go to the presumed solution. There are just too many incompetent bureaucrats, feckless politicians, parasitical lobbyists, and informational atrophy all throughout that pipeline. There's too much gunk for it to operate as efficiently as its 5 million person neighbor. 50 cents of every dollar goes to help homeless people or veterans or whatever. And the other 50 cents goes to defense contractors and lobbyists and just good old-fashioned incompetency where somebody just pisses it away in the bushes, doesn't go to anything at all. It would seem to me that if you're in that larger, more inefficient country where you're not getting 80 cents bang for buck, you're getting 50 cents per dollar, you have kind of one of two options you can go. You can either increase taxes and spending, knowing that a tremendous amount of that is just going to be lost. It's going to be lost to incompetency and graft, but at least the end result will be where you want it. Or you alter the nature of governance and you start offloading public duties onto the private sector. Or alternately, you restructure how government operates, where you have the accumulation of power away from the national government and more active in regional governments or local governments. All of which brings me to my big conclusion. In a geographically massive, populous, polyglot country with variable economics like the United States, we're simply not going to be able to pull off the kind of initiatives enjoyed by folks in Denmark who are living in a small, tight government that very likely is filled, even if in America our government is just filled with Aaron Sorkin's characters, all of whom are operating with Starfleet level efficiency and competency and truly believe in everything. Even then, I don't think that the composite factors are going to be the same, and that you're probably not going to be able to pull off Denmark and Washington, D.C. We're either going to have to rely more on markets or charities, or alternately, we're going to have to push government down. If we want that robust government, push it down more to the state and local level and restrict the resources and remit attributed to the national level. Okay, so concludes my exhaustive reasoning on this topic. To test my hypothesis, which is again that an optimal government size comes from a population of 3 to 10 million people in the state, I not only spent multiple days getting bloodshot eyes inputting international comparisons into a big-ass spreadsheet, I enlisted a research assistant to help me. Thank you, Anna Gorish. The goal here is to either disprove my hypothesis by finding no correlation between a state's size and the competency and efficiency of its government, or by spotting patterns or trends which might be useful to us. To determine this, we analyzed several affluent countries which my very sophisticated friends tend to drool over and or did a study abroad at during college and have never shut up about. Really nice, pleasant European countries. That list is basically the OECD, plus I added Singapore. I did not tabulate small tax dodge countries like Monaco, Liechtenstein, or the Channel Islands, even though they would benefit my thesis, because I don't think it's fair to say a tiny country works well just because rich people from other countries stash their money in it. That would seem to not be the relevant factor we're talking about. Naturally, those fake countries are going to have a higher than average GDP, but they're just operating as fiscal loopholes, so I'm discounting them. So we've compiled these countries in terms of geographic size, population, and population density to try to observe patterns in scaling. We then tabulated the overall tax revenue as percentage of GDP, the income tax rate, the top marginal income tax rate, and government spending per person. This was to assess how robust the government is in a given country. And while we did look at a few specific quantifiable outcomes, average household income, life expectancy, incarceration rates, I wound up relying on 3 specific indexes to try to glean which government works better. The Corruption Perception Index rates how corrupt a country perceives itself to be. That's attitudinal, which means governments that are better at hiding corruption will fare better on the test, and countries with higher levels of conspiracy theorists will fare worse, but it's the best indicator I can find for how much graft is lurking around a given government. To complement that, I dug up the OECD's Trust in Public Institutions survey to see if there's a correlation between small state size and trust in government. Next, the Gallup World Happiness Report ranks countries according to gross domestic product per capita, social support, healthy life expectancy, freedom to make your own life choices, generosity of the general population, and perceptions of internal and external corruption levels. It's a general well-being index for a nation. Methodology for this kind of thing is a little subjective, but it strikes me as useful in assessing whether or not a country works well. Then finally, the Fraser Institute's Human Freedom Index measures 82 indicators of personal and economic liberty, ranging from freedom of religion to minimal business regulation. As the name implies, the Fraser Institute's Human Freedom Index is a good proxy for the relative freedom and liberty of a country. You add all of that up, put it in a big spreadsheet like we did, and it's a stupid amount of data. God, I spent an entire day just compiling it all on top of Anna's work, and then another day figuring out how to make graphs on Google. Do I resent you for it? Yes, I do. But I forgive you. I'm a swell guy like that, I guess. By the way, patrons, I am putting a link to that spreadsheet in today's episode description on Patreon, should you like to play around with the numbers and see if you can spot any trends that I failed to notice. So, after all this number crunching, which was extensive, here's what I found out. First, we can definitely discount half of my thesis, that you need at least 3 million people for sufficient scale of economy to facilitate an optimal state. Iceland is number 4 in the Gallup World Happiness Report, and it has a population of only 372,000 people. It scored higher than the UK on the Human Freedom Index and has a life expectancy of 83 years and a median household income of about $80,000, $9,000 more than the median American household income. By any metric, Iceland is doing terrific, and with a small, boutique population. I've been there twice, and I can confirm Iceland is a great country which works very well. Would recommend to friends and neighbors. Likewise, Luxembourg has a population of about 600,000 people. It's also in the top 10 Gallup World Happiness Report and mid-range amongst the OECD on the Human Freedom Index. I have also been to Luxembourg. Nice little country. Not a zoning accident that sells cigarettes like Andorra, or a fake country like Monaco, but an actual nation-state, albeit small. And it seems to work just fine. So the first part of my hypothesis, that you need at least 3 million people for scale of economy, is demonstrably false. You can do very well with less than 500,000 people. Let's then test out the second half of my hypothesis, which I spent much, much more time refining, the idea that after 10 million people, a government is going to become less efficient and competent. I think my logic's pretty good on that. Say what you will about this episode, it's thorough. My God. However, cursory evaluation does compel me to drop at least one supporting argument that I made earlier, namely the idea that smaller populations in small land areas produce higher trust in public institutions, which in turn allow the state to spend that social capital on robust government programs, as opposed to large, geographically disparate states which have less trust in government and therefore are incapable of spending the social capital needed to build big government programs. Looking at the OECD's Trust in Public Institutions surveys, there's not a direct one-to-one relationship between country size and public trust in government, but there's a clear trend of larger countries like Germany, France, Spain, the UK, and the United States exhibiting lower levels of trust in parliament and government than smaller nation-states like Norway or Estonia. People in small countries don't automatically trust their government. Greece has very low trust in public institutions for excellent reasons spanning about 50 years, but citizens do tend to comparatively distrust their government in populations over 20 million people. In other words, size does not influence the floor of trust, but it does influence the ceiling of trust in public institutions. So great, this is awesome. This is exactly what I wanted to do after an hour of bloviating, go through a bunch of data and identify a pattern. The pattern is bigger state equals lower public trust in institutions. If my reasoning is correct, that would mean that bigger states cannot have as big comparatively of programs because they don't have the social capital to spend. And unfortunately for me, and my brilliant reasoning, because I thought that was a really interesting idea I came up with, I think we can toss it out. As a supporting argument, mind you, due to two very big data points that popped into my head. Social Security and Medicare. Both are large federal programs administered from a distant capital. Both are very popular with the majority of Americans, regardless of party or location. And while either one of these could run out of money, and might well in the next few years, neither major party is rhetorically or ideologically committed to abolishing or downsizing them. And both were enacted when geographic proximity was much more important than it is today. So clearly, disparate geography and a large population are not disqualifiers for big federal programs like Social Security and Medicare in the arena of political maintenance or implementation. Scaling issues might still affect their efficiency. We're going to talk about that next. Might affect rates of fraud and corruption or just general competency, but there's no demonstrable geographic or population size barrier limiting what a legislature can pull off. Moving on. I found no correlation between the size of a country and its ranking on the Human Freedom Index, nor in the Corruption Perception Index. Both of those findings surprised me. I thought big countries would naturally intrude on individual rights more than small countries, if nothing else because of the accumulation of red tape. Or potentially that smaller countries would be higher in corruption because they have less eyeballs watching their politicians or something. However, it would appear, insofar as my limited data can ascertain, the size of a state is not a primary determinant in whether or not it's corrupt or unfree. You can have a crummy little authoritarian state or a big-ass totalitarian one. You can have a giant, kick-ass free country like America or a dynamic little freedom incubator like Estonia or a healthy, mid-sized family minivan like Switzerland. Ditto on corruption. There might be some minor correlation with the size of a country and its capacity for corruption. It's possible that there is more corruption on the local or state level than the national level. My data doesn't get into that. This is an intergovernmental comparison. But on that level, between governments, between nations as a whole, size is clearly incidental to more relevant factors like the nature of institutions, deterrence, legal enforcements, culture, watchdogs, and so forth, insofar as corruption goes. So corruption and tyranny appear unrelated to the size of a country. Which brings us to the Gallup World Happiness Report, which does correlate with population size, and strongly at that. The World Happiness Report's top 10 countries in descending order of joy are Finland at the top, followed by Denmark, Switzerland, Iceland, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Luxembourg, New Zealand, and Austria. Of those, only the Netherlands exceed my proposed 10 million population threshold. The Dutch are 19 million strong and very tall, but every other country on that list was 10 million or under. The average population of these top 10 states, according to Gallup, is just 7 million people. So again, the Netherlands at 19 million, everybody else at 10 million or under. Top 10 best countries, according to Gallup, average of 7 million citizens. Now notice who didn't make the list. All the big European countries. Nobody is accusing France of being insufficiently socialist or insufficiently European, my God. But none of the large European social democracies or Great Britain made Gallup's top 10. Not France, Germany, Poland, Italy, the UK, or Spain. The average population size of those larger European states is 60 million. So there does appear to be statistical evidence for an optimum size of a country, namely a ceiling of 20 million people. I was off by 10 million, and I hereby revise and update my hypothesis. You need between 300,000 and 20 million people. You can do it beyond those numbers, but it's going to be best there. Of course, being good mentats, you and I know that with any statistical analysis, we run the risk of confusing causation with correlation. There are lots of other factors we could point to which explain why Finland is such a terrific country besides its relative size, which I would totally go into, and at great length and with additional scrutinous data, if I were an actual political scientist in the field of comparative government. Thank God I am not. You and I are not getting a master's degree in this particular topic, stretching in front of us for 4 languorous months. So we're not going to go too much further into that, although I'm sure we could. I will point out one variable that springs to mind. What if size is one relevant factor and the other is homogeneity? Maybe they have a reinforcing relationship with one another. Returning to the issue of social trust, which I was largely wrong about, and noting the exceptions of Social Security and Medicare, which disproved part of my hypothesis, there's good data that people tend to have higher levels of trust when they're around people who look, think, and speak like them, and that they harbor suspicions about those who don't. It's the reason that symphonies have prospective musicians audition behind a screen. It's much of the logic that undergirds white privilege and systemic racism, that a male boss will subconsciously prefer and promote a fellow white dude over women or people of color in the office, or that a white landlord will trust another white guy more than applicants of ethnic minorities and assign leases accordingly. If you think white privilege and systemic racism are real and potent forces in society, it's hard to argue they would not likewise have a bolstering effect on social trust in homogeneous places, like, for example, Finland, the top of Gallup's list. Gallup's top country on the happiness index also happens to be 92% Finnish. It's not a stretch for me to think that monolithic cultures, or comparatively monolithic cultures, I'm sure they're wonderful and nuanced in their own way, but they're much less polyglot than the United States or Europe as a whole, that those cultures like Finland, Norway, Austria, Iceland, and most of those other top 10 happy countries, according to Gallup, have higher social trust than polyglot cultures such as ourselves, or Britain, or France, or Germany, which has a very large immigrant population. High-trust countries, which are demographically monolithic, might then be more enthusiastic and competent at executing communitarian ideals as opposed to more individualized ideals. Consider the range of political opinion in the United States and the various warring clumps of ideology, libertarians and social democrats and labor democrats and traditionalist conservatives and moderates and independents and baritones. Now imagine what you think of as the range of opinion in Finland. My guess is that the range of political opinion in Finland, from our perspective, ranges from center-left to slightly left of center-left, a 3-millimeter bandwidth. I don't know that. I'm willing to guess that. It seems like the kind of place where you could motivate everybody to get on the same page, act as the same team, make things work. Their us factor, with convergent political views and 92% ethnic homogeneity, is going to be stronger than a polyglot culture. A polyglot culture like America, the most diverse country in the history of the world, which, by the way, I like and am in favor of, with wildly deviating social values and political preferences and countries of origin and ethnic and regional variation, we're going to have a harder time leaning into that us factor. We're going to lean more into the I'll do it myself factor. Our community is going to do its thing. Your community does its thing. My kids are going to go to homeschool. Your kids are going to go to public schools. We're just going to be better at more individualistic approaches towards governance, I think. And I also want to bring this up. As a good mentat working on your behalf, I found Gallup's World Happiness Index, World Happiness Report, to be useful. It's an interesting bundle of statistics, but it's not gospel. None of these things are. Even if its data were completely perfect, what constitutes happiness is largely subjective. So, for example, I am bothered by poverty. I really want to get rid of poverty. I think poverty is horrible. I'm not really bothered by inequality. To me, these are different things. Just doesn't bother me. So if I were creating my own happiness index, I would rank a society with low homelessness and high inequality as very happy. Whereas, and I know I'm not normal, most people would rank such a country relatively low. They would say that the high inequality would make it an unhappy society. So I don't know that any of these indexes are the one thing you want to look at. And I got to throw this in. I need to add a little bit of unfounded speculation when we're talking about all of these wonderful Nordic countries. The sorts of ultra-progressive white people in America who live in Portland, Oregon, and exist on a political spectrum spanning all the way from Elizabeth Warren on one side to Bernie Sanders on the other, tend to have just a raging boner for extremely white social democracies in Northern Europe, and are much less inclined to invoke the political economies of other social democracies that don't work as well, like Spain, Greece, or much of Latin America. In which case, it would not surprise me if they selected metrics which confirm that Northern Europe is wonderful and America is dumb and should be like whatever country they did their study abroad in, that America's stupid and I'm embarrassed by it and I should have been born in Sweden and my God, I own a beret, unironically. Again, I have no data for that. It's just a gut feeling. But in the same way that I could see a bunch of libertarians coming up with something that really, really pushes countries with low government as the best country and coming up with metrics that do that, or I don't know, maybe conservatives somehow figuring out how to make Switzerland the best country because of cantons and federation and state versus, I don't know. It's possible that the data here has been somewhat selected with a goal in mind. Although I did find one metric interesting. This doesn't really militate in favor or against my thesis here, but it is a pattern that I saw that I want to point out to you. It turns out OECD countries tend to tax and spend about the same amount per citizen, regardless of how many citizens they actually have. Iceland's government spends about $29,000 per citizen per year, whereas the much, much larger United States, when you add up federal, state, and local expenditures, spends about $28,000 per citizen per year. Massive population discrepancies. One rhetorically free market country, the other one I'm sure has some sort of socialized healthcare, and yet the gap in per capita spending is insignificant. Germany and France are a bit more, $30,000 per year. United Kingdom is a bit less, $24,000 per year. But I say that I suspect if we were to factor in Britain's local spending or the budget of regional parliaments like Scotland, I bet you it would be right smack dab in the same range as us, about $28,000 per year. The ratio of government spending to GDP, also similar among OECD nations. Iceland's total government spending is 49% of national GDP. About half of all their money is spent by the government. The American federal government spends much less, 14% of GDP, much less than those other countries. But remember, that's just federal spending. When I factor in local spending, state spending, I come up with 40% of GDP spent by government in America. When looking at similar sum totals, Britain, Germany, and France respectively spend 44%, 50%, and 61% of GDP. Now, that's all a very math-heavy way of saying developed economies all tax and spend similar amounts. It is decidedly not that the Europeans tax more and spend more than evil, skinflint, greedy, anti-government, individualistic Americans. It's how we spend the money that differs between these regimes. Again, I wish to reiterate this. America does not have a low-tax, cheapskate government compared to high-tax, high-spending European social democracies. Our taxes and spending are comparable. It's just that we seem to be pissing ours away, at least when it comes to health care and life expectancy. Now, I initially thought that it was just going to boil down to defense spending, that Europeans are spending their money on health care and we're spending our money on defense. And that's why we spend the same amount but have different outcomes. But that's not right either. America spends more money on health care than all the cute European countries with socialized medicine. And we do spend more money on defense than any of those countries, but proportionally not by orders of magnitude. The U.S. spends about 3.5% of GDP on the military. The U.K. is 2.2%. Germany's 1.3%. France is 1.9%. So yeah, we spend more than twice what Germany spends, but as a percent of the overall economy, it's not that much more. We're proportionally on par with New Zealand. So again, the issue is not total taxes or spending. It appears to be competency, efficiency. So what's the optimal size of a state? Is it like a door? Have we figured this out? Long story short, I don't think we have. I don't think we have the data or the metrics necessary to make that assessment. We can say, generally speaking, countries that we identify as laudably healthy, prosperous, and well-run have homogeneous populations of less than 20 million people. Generally speaking, we can say it makes more sense to compare the United States to the European Union than to compare it to the component European member states. But when we try to pin it down to something specific, like healthcare, I'm weirdly unable to nail down anything quantifiably prohibitive. Generally, it appears that small homogeneous monocultures have higher social trust, which could reasonably lend itself to stronger communitarian projects. But then Social Security and Medicare are highly popular over here, so they're not. It's not a rule against, it's just kind of a trend. The United States is about 5 times more populous than the United Kingdom. Seems rational to wonder if their system could scale up to ours, doesn't it? That was kind of what I came up with at the beginning of the program. But at the same time, the United Kingdom is at least 5 times bigger than Sweden, Portugal, Austria, or Switzerland. Well, why would scaling be immaterial when comparing the healthcare of one of those small countries up to the United Kingdom, but suddenly prohibitive when scaling from the UK to the United States? Unfortunately, after this very thinky journey we've been on together, and I hope that it stimulated thought in you because we didn't arrive at a really satisfying answer, in my opinion, I'm forced to admit that I can't quantify the optimum size of a state. I can point to some generalizations, but they're broad, and they are potentially confusing correlation with causation. What would be most useful for answering this question would be a relevant metric we could use to compare countries by competency and efficiency of spending. If I were the Harvard School of Public Policy or the Rand Corporation, or if I ever secure funding from my proposed think tank, the Heaton Institute for Unsuspicious Activity, I'd develop some kind of metric relevant to the question, what is the optimum size of a state? Like a national efficiency rating or an intergovernmental competency index or something like that. I'm a little surprised, given how much we fight about government and taxes and spending, nobody seems to be trying to answer this question that I'm struggling with. Why am I'm a guy that writes horse jokes for a living. Why has this fallen upon me? We have lots of ideological fights about states rights, the will of the founders, big LBJ social democracy, and what's better, but I don't find a lot of solid data on optimum government size, and I don't know what that admission says. Well, I'm exhausted. I am all thinked out. I'm going to go re-up my blood sugar levels or something, eat a fruit. Patrons, I would love to hear from you on today's episode. Are there more relevant metrics we could have used to assess the optimum state size? Is there something that I haven't noticed? Do you have a counter-hypothesis on the optimum size of a state? What I have arrived at is that states tend to work best when they are 20 million people or less and more convergent in opinion and culture, and therefore a big polyglot state like us either needs to be more libertarian or more federated. That's the conclusion I draw. Is there one that you have that's different than that? Ideally, one which is inferential and relying on empirical evidence rather than deductive or ideological screeds. I look forward to hearing from you in today's comment section on Patreon. And if you want to weigh in on that, head to patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. That's the show. Thanks for listening. Thank you, Eric Stipe, who edited today's program. Thank you, Anna Gorish, who helped gather some of the laborious data that went in today's episode. Patrons, you can find that in today's show notes on Patreon. And thank you, patrons of the show who funded the whole damn thing. I would not have done this episode without your support. I don't do spreadsheets and data compilation for free, so I hope it made you think. Thank you for funding it. Until next time, I've been Andrew Heaton, and so have you.